From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I think it's very, very unfair what's happened to General Flynn, the way he was treated, and the documents and papers that were illegally, I stress that, illegally leaked. Very, very unfair.
Days after the forced resignation of General Michael Flynn as National Security Advisor, more questions are being raised about the Trump team's ties to Russia before and after the November election. This comes as U.S. intelligence officials are now reportedly withholding sensitive information from the Trump administration because they're concerned it could be leaked or compromised. Is Donald Trump at war with his own intelligence agencies?
Let me tell you, you take on the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday at getting back at you. So even for a practical, supposedly hard-nosed businessman, he's being really dumb to do this.
We'll speak with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept. His most recent piece is headlined, "The Leakers Who Exposed General Flynn's Lie Committed Serious and Wholly Justified Felonies." All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Donald Trump Wednesday ended a long-standing U.S. commitment to the establishment of a Palestinian state, saying he had no preference for either a one- or two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Trump's comment came during a joint news conference at the White House with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Looking at two-state and one-state, and I like the one that both parties like. I'm very happy with the one that both parties like. I can live with either one. I thought for a while the two-state looked like it may be the easier of the two. But honestly, if Bibi and if the Palestinians, if Israel and the Palestinians are happy, I'm happy with the one they like the best.
Israel continues to annex Palestinian lands to construct Jewish-only settlements, leading many observers, including former Secretary of State John Kerry, to say a two-state solution may no longer be viable. But Trump's remarks represented a break from 20 years of official U.S. support for a Palestinian state alongside Israel. In the West Bank, Chief Palestinian negotiator Saeb Erekat responded to President Trump's comments.
Those who believe that they can undermine the two-state solution and replace it with what I call one state, two systems, maintaining the status quo now, apartheid, I don't think in the 21st century they will get away with it.
In a statement, the group Jewish Voice for Peace said, quote, "Today, Trump and Netanyahu spoke of their shared values of democracy and respect for human rights. These are alternative facts. Their shared values are in reality a shared agenda of walls, militarism, xenophobia, racism, anti-Muslim bigotry, and borders closed to refugees," they said. On Capitol Hill, lawmakers are ratcheting up their demands for an investigation into alleged ties between senior aides to Donald Trump and Russian officials. Republican Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa joined California Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein Wednesday in a letter to the Justice Department asking for transcripts of former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn's calls with the Russian ambassador last December before Trump's inauguration. The calls broke U.S. law and led to Flynn's resignation on Monday. At Wednesday's press conference, President Trump defended Flynn.
Michael Flynn, General Flynn, is a wonderful man. I think he's been treated very, very unfairly by the media, as I call it, the fake media in many cases. And I think it's really a sad thing that he was treated so badly.
Trump's comment came a day after his press secretary, Sean Spicer, said the level of trust between the president and Flynn had eroded to the point where Trump had to demand Flynn's resignation. The Wall Street Journal is reporting U.S. intelligence officials are withholding sensitive intelligence from President Trump because they're concerned it could be leaked or compromised. The New York Times is reporting Trump is considering ordering a review of the nation's intelligence agencies led by Steven Feinberg, a billionaire private equity executive who's close to Stephen Bannon and Jared Kushner. The turmoil surrounding Flynn's firing drew an alarming comment from the head of U.S. Special Operations Command, General Raymond Thomas told a military conference in Maryland, quote, "Our government continues to be in unbelievable turmoil. I hope they sort it out soon because we're a nation at war," he said. In Moscow, Kremlin officials denied any contact with the Trump campaign in the run-up to November's election. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is meeting Trump's newly minted Secretary of State, former ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson, during talks in Bonn today. Tillerson's expected to confront Lavrov over Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. Meanwhile, Russia's military has deployed a secret nuclear-capable cruise missile that violates a landmark 1987 arms reduction treaty between the U.S. and Russia. That's according to the New York Times, which reports the new weapon threatens to derail any future arms treaties with Russia and has the Pentagon considering whether to develop medium-range cruise missiles of its own. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy says it's tracking a Russian intelligence vessel that's come within 30 miles of the coast of Connecticut. The ship appears to be spying on a U.S. submarine base. Fast food CEO Andrew Puzder has withdrawn his nomination as Labor Secretary 1 day before his confirmation hearing was set to begin. Puzder was facing increasing criticism for reports of widespread sexual harassment at his chain restaurants, as well as labor and safety violations. He's also under fire for allegations of domestic violence against his ex-wife, who even appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show in disguise in 1990 to speak about being abused. The website Politico published video of the appearance Wednesday.
The most frightening thing was leaving, because once I made that break and once I made it public, and remember, my ex-husband was a public figure. Everyone knew him and knew what he was doing. And once I made that public, he vowed revenge. He said, "I will see you in the gutter. This will never be over. You will pay for this." I wound up losing everything.
Vermont Independent Senator Bernie Sanders praised Puzder's decision to step down, saying, quote, "We need a Secretary of Labor who's going to fight to raise the minimum wage to a living wage of $15 an hour and pay equity for women. We don't need a labor secretary who makes millions while his workers are paid starvation wages." CNN is reporting the Pentagon is considering a plan to deploy ground troops to Syria. The U.S. has already authorized up to 500 special operation forces in Syria, but the Pentagon plan under consideration would allow for a large conventional force. The President Trump has given Defense Secretary James Mattis until the end of the month to come up with a plan to fight ISIS. In Yemen, a pair of U.S.-backed, Saudi-led coalition airstrikes ripped through a funeral reception overnight, killing 8 women and a child. Witnesses say a second airstrike targeted emergency workers responding to the initial attack. This is survivor Hamid Ali.
The people are still looking under the rubble, like you see. Each one is looking for their child or their sister. And this all happened from the bombing. There are 9 victims, and they're still searching for more, and there are dozens of injured in the hospital.
The Saudi-led coalition battling Yemen's Houthi rebels has the support of the United States. The United Nations warns the bombing campaign and naval blockade has devastated Yemen's infrastructure and has left 12 million people facing the threat of famine. In Iraq, a suicide bomber in a pickup truck detonated in Baghdad's Sadr City Wednesday, killing at least 15 people and wounding 50 others. There was no immediate claim of responsibility, but ISIS has claimed similar attacks targeting Shia communities in recent months. In Malaysia, police have arrested a 3rd suspect in the apparent assassination of the estranged half-brother of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-nam told medics on Monday he was sprayed in the face with a chemical agent while waiting to board a flight at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. He became disoriented from the poisoning and suffered a seizure before dying en route to a nearby hospital. Kim Jong-nam was the eldest son of the former ruler Kim Jong-il. He became estranged from North Korea's ruling dynasty in 2001 after he was caught using a forged passport to enter Japan, where he told officials he hoped to visit Tokyo Disneyland. South Korean officials believe the North Korean regime long sought to assassinate Kim. In Texas, agents with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, entered the El Paso County courthouse last week in order to arrest an undocumented woman who'd gone to court seeking a protective order against her alleged domestic abuser. County Attorney Joanne Bernal said Wednesday she fears the move sets a precedent that will see undocumented survivors of domestic assault stay with their abusers rather than risk deportation and separation from their families. Meanwhile, in Denver, Colorado, an undocumented mother of 4 sought refuge in a church Wednesday after ICE officials denied her request to remain in the country. Jeanette Vizguera skipped a scheduled check-in with ICE officials and instead brought her family to the First Unitarian Society Church, where she addressed supporters.
And if this system thinks that it can break me, that it can make me kneel, the system is wrong, because you can see the reasons behind me why I am fighting so hard to win my case. And I know that I am not alone, that there are many people in the community and in the immigrant community who share my anger and my passion for justice.
Vizguera came to the U.S. from Mexico in 1997. She previously won 5 postponements of deportation, but said Wednesday she doubts she could win a similar reprieve under the Trump administration. In Washington, D.C., the Senate's expected to narrowly confirm Congressman Mick Mulvaney as head of the White House Budget Office. Mulvaney is a Tea Party Republican from South Carolina who's opposed by the entire Senate Democratic caucus. After Mulvaney's confirmation vote, the Senate is scheduled to take up the nomination of Oklahoma Attorney General Scott Pruitt to head the Environmental Protection Agency. Democrats are calling for a delay on the vote while a court decides whether to force Pruitt's office to turn over email communications with coal, oil, and gas companies. Meanwhile, Republican Senator Susan Collins of Maine said Wednesday she'll vote against Pruitt, but the defection won't be enough to derail his confirmation, and Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia has said he'll become the lone Democrat to vote in favor of Pruitt. The frontrunner to become science advisor to President Trump called climate scientists a glassy-eyed cult and falsely accused the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, of manipulating climate data. Princeton University physicist William Happer made the remarks in an interview published Wednesday by The Guardian, saying, quote, "There's a whole area of climate so-called science that's really more like a cult. It's like Hare Krishna or something like that. They're glassy-eyed and they chant," end quote. Happer also supports prohibiting federally funded scientists from communicating their findings to the public. The Standing Rock Sioux Tribe has filed a fresh legal challenge to the Dakota Access Pipeline, asking a federal judge in Washington, D.C. to block an easement allowing construction on the final leg of the $3.8 billion project. Tuesday's lawsuit came a day after a judge threw out a separate legal challenge calling for a temporary restraining order against construction. The legal fight came as a top executive with the company building the Dakota Access Pipeline Wednesday compared his opponents to terrorists. In a written statement submitted to Congress, Energy Transfer Partners Executive Vice President Joey Mahmoud accused water protectors of violence and blasted them for shutting down pipeline pumping stations. Mahmoud wrote, quote, "Had these actions been undertaken by foreign nationals, they could only be described as acts of terrorism," he said. In medical news, patients' advocates have launched legal challenges to patents on hepatitis C drugs in India and Argentina, saying pharmaceutical companies are profiting from monopoly prices that leave millions unable to afford life-saving medications. In a statement, Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, said, quote, "There are 80 million people worldwide living with hepatitis C, and we need a wide range of combination treatments available at an affordable price. With patents blocking generic competition, treatment remains prohibitively expensive in many countries." unquote. And investigative journalist Jeremy Scahill has canceled his appearance Friday night on Real Time with Bill Maher after the HBO program scheduled white nationalist and Breitbart news editor Milo Yiannopoulos to appear on the same episode. In a statement, Scahill said, quote, "There is no value in debating him. Appearing on Real Time will provide Yiannopoulos with a large, important platform to openly advocate his racist anti-immigrant campaign. Yiannopoulos' appearance could also be used to incite violence against immigrants, transgender people, and others at a time when the Trump administration is already seeking to formalize a war against some of the most vulnerable people in our society," Scahill wrote. Jeremy Scahill is co-founder of The Intercept and former producer and correspondent with Democracy Now! And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We turn now to look at the growing scandal over the Trump administration's alleged dealings with Russia before and after the November election. There have been a number of developments in the past 24 hours. The Wall Street Journal is reporting U.S. intelligence officials are withholding sensitive intelligence from President Trump because they're concerned it could be leaked or compromised. The New York Times is reporting Trump is considering ordering a review of the nation's intelligence agencies, led by Stephen Feinberg, a billionaire private equity executive who's close to Stephen Bannon and Jared Kushner. Meanwhile, Trump has publicly defended Michael Flynn, who resigned Monday as National Security Advisor after admitting he gave Vice President Mike Pence and others incomplete information about his calls with the Russian ambassador in December. Trump spoke about Flynn during his press conference with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Michael Flynn, General Flynn, is a wonderful man. I think he's been treated very, very unfairly by the media, as I call it, the fake media in many cases. And I think it's really a sad thing that he was treated so badly. I think in addition to that, from intelligence, papers are being leaked, things are being leaked. It's criminal action, criminal act, and it's been going on for a long time before me, but now it's really going on. And people are trying to cover up for a terrible loss that the Democrats had under Hillary Clinton. I think it's very, very unfair what's happened to General Flynn, the way he was treated, and the documents and papers that were illegally, I stress that, illegally leaked. Very, very unfair.
Trump's comments came just a day after White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer said Trump had lost faith in General Flynn.
This was an act of trust. Whether or not he actually misled the vice president was the issue. And that was ultimately what led to the president asking for and accepting the resignation of General Flynn. That's it, pure and simple. It was a matter of trust.
While congressional Democrats and some Republicans are pushing for probes into Trump's ties to Russia, Trump has focused largely on going after those who've leaked information to the press. In a tweet this morning, Trump wrote, quote, "The spotlight has finally been put on the low-life leakers. They will be caught." On Wednesday, Trump indirectly accused the NSA and FBI of being behind the leaks. He wrote, quote, "Information is being illegally given to the failing New York Times and Washington Post by the intelligence community. NSA and FBI, just like Russia."
Some supporters of Trump, including Breitbart News, have accused the intelligence agencies of attempting to wage a deep state coup against the president. Meanwhile, some critics of Trump are openly embracing such activity. Bill Kristol, the prominent Republican analyst who founded the Weekly Standard, wrote on Twitter, "Obviously strongly prefer normal democratic and constitutional politics, but if it comes to it, prefer the deep state to the Trump state," unquote. To help make sense of what's happening, we're joined by the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald, co-founder of The Intercept. His most recent piece is headlined, "The Leakers Who Exposed General Flynn's Lie Committed Serious and Wholly Justified Felonies." Glenn, welcome to Democracy Now! Explain what you mean.
There's no question that whoever leaked the contents of General Flynn's telephone calls with the Russian ambassador and other Russian diplomats committed what the law regards as extremely serious crimes. As we all know from the last 8 years under President Obama, the U.S. government treats it as a criminal act, a felony, to leak information that is deemed classified. In the scheme of what is regarded as criminal in terms of leaks, the most serious, or one of the most serious bits of information that can be leaked is what's called signals intelligence, or information gathered by the NSA or the CIA or other intelligence agencies in terms of eavesdropping on foreign governments. And that's exactly what got leaked, was information that the NSA and the CIA say that they gathered as a result of targeting Russian officials with eavesdropping. And along the course of that eavesdropping, they happened to hear General Flynn's conversations with those Russian officials. That's what they claim. It's possible they actually targeted General Flynn. We don't know. That's the claim. And if that is true, what they're claiming, it means that the leaking of this information is considered a very serious felony. In fact, the law says that it's not just whoever leaks signals intelligence is guilty of a felony, but anyone who publishes it, too. So theoretically, it makes the journalists at the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC News, all of whom have leaked signals intelligence, guilty of felonies. My view is that the First Amendment's freedom of the press clause would bar any such prosecutions, but at least under the statute, it is a crime. So then the question becomes, well, if it's criminal, is it justified? And my view is the same view that I had for the 8 years under President Obama and for the years before that under President Bush, which is that people inside the government who leak classified information that the public has a right to know, even if they're breaking the law, are acting commendably and justifiably and heroically, and that those people ought to be celebrated and treated as people defending democracy and transparency and not be treated as criminals. Unfortunately, over the last 8 years, Democrats have had a completely different view of people who leak classified information. And the tweet that you just read from President Trump saying whoever leaked this information are low-life leakers who deserve to be punished, that sounds very, very, very similar to everything I've heard from most Democrats over the last 8 years as they called for the imprisonment of Chelsea Manning and Thomas Drake and Edward Snowden and the long list of other whistleblowers and leakers that President Obama so aggressively and vindictively prosecuted. But for me, my view has not changed, which is when an official as senior as General Flynn lies to the public, which is what he did, he denied publicly that he discussed the issue of sanctions with the Russian ambassador in his December phone call. Information that shows that he lied is information that the public has the right to know. And even though I think there are very grave dangers and grave concerns that I hope we'll discuss in terms of what the deep state is doing in trying to destroy the Trump administration that was duly elected, in this particular case, whoever leaked this information helped the public to understand and to learn exactly how General Flynn lied. And therefore, despite being illegal, highly illegal, I actually think it's also wholly justified, as I wrote in that piece.
Well, Glenn, I want to turn to something NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden said to you nearly 3 years ago when he first spoke out against NSA abuses.
Any analyst at any time can target anyone, any selector anywhere. Where those communications will be picked up depends on the range of the sensor networks and the authorities that that analyst is empowered with. Not all analysts have the ability to target everything. But I, sitting at my desk, certainly had the authorities to wiretap anyone from you or your accountant to a federal judge to even the president if I had a personal email.
So, Glenn, can you talk about that and the response that was received to the leaks of Edward Snowden compared to now, the leaks of intelligence officials now?
So on the question of the eavesdropping powers of the NSA as revealed by the intercepts of General Flynn's communications, we don't actually know for certain what the methodology was that was used to eavesdrop on him. Was the NSA legally pursuant to a FISA warrant targeting General Flynn as part of an investigation, either an intelligence investigation or a law enforcement investigation conducted by the FBI. Were they, as they claim, only doing routine surveillance on officials of an adversary country, in this case Russia, and just coincidentally and by accident happened to catch the conversation that General Flynn was having with those targets of the surveillance in Moscow? We don't know. But what this does illustrate is, let's assume for the moment that the NSA and the CIA, for once, are actually telling the truth, and that the way that they eavesdropped on General Flynn was not by targeting him, but by targeting the Russians with whom he was communicating. What this reveals is something very important, which is when the Edward Snowden story first broke and the debate around the world was triggered, the U.S. government kept saying over and over, if you're an American citizen, we can't listen in on your calls unless we first get a warrant from the court, and therefore there's nothing you have to worry about. Now, that was a very warped sort of thing to say, because that meant that for 95% of the world who are called non-Americans, what the government was saying, oh, for you, you have no protections. We can listen in on your calls at any time without getting a judge to approve, which is actually true. And that's one of the reasons why people all over the world outside of the United States were so horrified to learn of what the NSA was doing. But the broader and more important point is that what the U.S. government was saying, it was actually completely false. The U.S. government constantly eavesdrops on the telephone calls of American citizens without getting a warrant of any kind, despite what the Constitution requires. And that's because the law that was enacted in 2008, called the FISA Amendments Act, with President Obama's approval, he was a senator at the time, he voted for it, actually authorizes the U.S. government to listen in on Americans' calls with no warrant, as long as they're talking to someone outside of the United States who the government says they're targeting. And that's what this episode shows, is they were able to listen in on General Flynn's calls, if you believe them, with no warrant, because they say that they were targeting someone with whom he was communicating. As far as the reaction is concerned in terms of how Edward Snowden's leaks were received versus this leak, it's like night and day. I have not yet heard, literally not one Democrat, condemn the leakers inside the CIA or the intelligence community who leaked signals intelligence and in the process alerted these Russian officials to the fact that their communications have been compromised. That's what these leaks did. They told these Russian officials with whom General Flynn was communicating, we have successfully penetrated your communication systems, and you can be sure that they are now in response fortifying the communications that they use and blocking out the NSA and CIA. There was probably harm done by whoever did this leak. I haven't heard one Democrat condemn it on the grounds that it's criminal. I haven't heard one Democrat say that there should be an investigation to find these leakers and put them in prison for violating the law. And yet all I heard from Democrats, not all I heard, because there were a lot of Democrats who supported Manning and Snowden and Drake, but certainly Democratic officials in D.C. were almost unanimous under Obama in saying that leakers should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, that they're traitors. Chelsea Manning just spent 7 years in prison under harsh conditions for leaking information way less sensitive than what these leakers about General Flynn just leaked. And yes, President Obama commuted her sentence, but only after his administration imprisoned her under conditions that the UN said was basically torture, and kept her in prison for 7 years, even though there was no harm demonstrated from anything she leaked. So what Democrats seem to think is leaks under President Obama, even if they show that high-level officials are lying, as Edward Snowden showed James Clapper was, are evil, are criminal, and the whistleblowers should be thrown in jail. Leaks under President Trump, by contrast, are heroic and noble, and we should celebrate the people who are doing it and oppose any effort to hunt them down and investigate them and find them and punish them, as President Trump is vowing to do. The reality is that whistleblowers are a very valuable part of our democracy. They should be cherished and heralded and protected, regardless of which party controls the White House.
And Glenn, what about the Republican response? You've talked about the Democratic Party response, but how did the Republican Party, for the most part, respond to the Snowden leaks versus what's happened now?
Well, ironically, the Republican response is actually consistently heinous, but at least it's consistent. There were a few Republicans, usually former office holders or some outliers in the Republican Party like Rand Paul or Justin Amash, people from the libertarian wing, who were somewhat supportive of the Snowden leaks, but overall, the Republican establishment was contemptuous of Edward Snowden. In fact, Mike Pompeo, the former Republican congressman who is now Donald Trump's chief at the CIA, called for Edward Snowden's execution. Donald Trump himself called for Edward Snowden's execution. Lindsey Graham and John McCain and Marco Rubio all called Edward Snowden a traitor. So in some sense, the Republicans are being consistent because they're now saying the same thing, which is that whoever leaked this information ought to be investigated, hunted down, and punished to the fullest extent of the law, which is more or less the same thing they said about leakers and whistleblowers under President Obama. It's the Democrats who have completely switched their position, as they so often do, the minute that the party controlling the White House changed.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion, also talk about what happened at the White House yesterday with the Netanyahu-Trump meeting, and so much more. We're speaking with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald, one of the founding editors of The Intercept. His piece in The Intercept, "The Leakers Who Exposed General Flynn is Flynn's Lie Committed Serious and Wholly Justified Felonies." Stay with us. Music by Mina. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We're looking at the growing scandal over the Trump administration's alleged dealings with Russia before and after the November election. In early January, Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer appeared on the Rachel Maddow show and suggested the intelligence community may try to get back at Donald Trump.
Let me tell you, you take on the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday at getting back at you. So even for a practical, supposedly hard-nosed businessman, he's being really dumb to do this.
That was the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer in January. Some supporters of Trump, including Breitbart News, are now accusing the intelligence agencies of attempting to wage a deep state coup against the president. Meanwhile, some critics of Trump are openly embracing such activity, like Bill Kristol, the prominent Republican analyst who founded the Weekly Standard. He wrote on Twitter, "Obviously, strongly prefer normal democratic and constitutional politics, but if it comes to it, prefer the deep state to the Trump state." So, still with us, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept, speaking to us from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Glenn, explain what the deep state is and respond.
The deep state, although there's no precise or scientific definition, generally refers to the agencies in Washington that are permanent power factions. They stay and exercise power even as presidents who are elected come and go. They typically exercise their power in secret, in the dark, and so they're barely subject to democratic accountability if they're subject to it at all. It's agencies like the CIA, the NSA, and the other intelligence agencies that are essentially designed to disseminate disinformation and deceit and propaganda, and have a long history of doing not only that, but also have a long history of the world's worst war crimes, atrocities, and death squads. This is who not just people like Bill Kristol, but lots of Democrats are placing their faith in, are trying to empower, are cheering for, as they exert power separate and apart from, in fact, in opposition to, the political officials to whom they're supposed to be subordinate. And this is not just about Russia. You go all the way back to the campaign And what you saw was that leading members of the intelligence community, including Mike Morrell, who was the acting CIA chief under President Obama, and Michael Hayden, who ran both the CIA and the NSA under George W. Bush, were very outspoken supporters of Hillary Clinton. In fact, Michael Morrell went to the New York Times and Michael Hayden went to the Washington Post during the campaign to praise Hillary Clinton and to say that Donald Trump had become a recruit of Russia. The CIA and the intelligence community were vehemently in support of Clinton and vehemently opposed to Trump from the beginning. And the reason was because they liked Hillary Clinton's policies better than they liked Donald Trump's. One of the main priorities of the CIA for the last 5 years has been a proxy war in Syria designed to achieve regime change with the Assad regime. Hillary Clinton was not only for that, she was critical of Obama for not allowing it to go further and wanted to impose a no-fly zone in Syria and confront the Russians. Donald Trump took exactly the opposite view. He said, we shouldn't care who rules Syria. We should allow the Russians and even help the Russians kill ISIS and al-Qaeda and other people in Syria. So Trump's agenda that he ran on was completely antithetical to what the CIA wanted. Clinton's was exactly what the CIA wanted, and so they were behind her. And so they've been trying to undermine Trump for many months throughout the election, and now that he won, they are not just undermining him with leaks, but actively subverting him. There's claims that they're withholding information from him on the grounds that they don't think he should have it and can be trusted with it. They are empowering themselves to enact policy. Now, I happen to think that the Trump presidency is extremely dangerous. You just listed off in your newscast that led the show many reasons. They want to dismantle the environment. They want to eliminate the safety net. They want to empower billionaires. They want to enact bigoted policies against Muslims and immigrants and so many others. And it is important to resist them. And there are lots of really great ways to resist them, such as getting courts to restrain them, citizen activism, and most important of all, having the Democratic Party engage in self-critique to ask itself how it can be a more effective political force in the United States after it has collapsed on all levels. That isn't what this resistance is now doing. What they're doing instead is trying to take maybe the only faction worse than Donald Trump, which is the deep state, the CIA, with its histories of atrocities, and say they ought to almost engage in like a soft coup where they take the elected president and prevent him from enacting his policies. And I think it is extremely dangerous to do that. Even if you're somebody who believes that both the CIA and the deep state on the one hand and the Trump presidency on the other are extremely dangerous, as I do, there's a huge difference between the two, which is that Trump was democratically elected and is subject to democratic controls, as these courts just demonstrated, as the media is showing, as citizens are proving. But on the other hand, the CIA was elected by nobody. They're barely subject to democratic controls at all. And so to urge that the CIA and the intelligence community empower itself to undermine the elected branches of government is insanity. That is a prescription for destroying democracy overnight in the name of saving it. And yet that's what so many, not just neocons, but the neocons' allies in the Democratic Party are now urging and cheering, and it's incredibly warped and dangerous to watch them do that.
And the Wall Street Journal's report that says now intelligence officials are not giving President Trump all the information because they're concerned about what he'll do with it, not to mention intelligence agencies of other countries deeply concerned about what Trump will do with it, and particularly concerned about what he might share with Russia.
Well, so first of all, there's a media issue here, which is that if you look at the Wall Street Journal report, it's pretty much exactly the same as every other significant report about Russia over the last 6 months, many of which have proven to be completely false. It's based on anonymous officials making extremely vague claims. Even the Wall Street Journal says, we don't know who's doing this, withholding information. We don't know how much information is being withheld. Secondly, the idea that Donald Trump is some kind of an agent or a spy of Russia, or that he is being blackmailed by Russia and is going to pass secret information to the Kremlin and endanger American agents on purpose, is an incredibly crazy claim that has been nowhere proven to be true. It reminds me of the kind of things Glenn Beck used to say about Obama while he stood at his chalkboard and drew those unstable charts that he drew, these wild conspiracy theories that are without evidence. We ought to have a serious, sober, structured investigation of the claims that Russia hacked the DNC and John Podesta's emails, and that there were improper ties between Donald Trump and the Russians, and that ought to be made public so that we could see the information. But this constant media obsession of leaking whatever someone whispers to them about Donald Trump and Russia because they know it'll get their reporters huge numbers of retweets on Twitter and tons of traffic by people who are being fed what they want to hear is really feeding into the worst kind of hysteria and even fake news that the media says they're trying to combat. These are really serious claims that merit serious investigation, and that's exactly what we're not getting.
Well, in a recent piece in The Intercept by one of your colleagues, they write, if in fact all of this is nonsense, Trump has the power as president to make that clear immediately by declassifying all government intercepts of communications between Russian nationals and anyone in his orbit. So do you think, Glenn, that Trump ought to be doing that?
I mean, it's an interesting point because, for example, there have been lots of claims made about the communications that General Flynn had with Russian diplomats and what these transcripts supposedly reflect, and yet nobody has seen the transcripts. We've seen little bits and pieces of them. We haven't seen the whole transcript. We ought to see that whole transcript, and my colleague John Schwartz, who wrote that piece, is absolutely right that it's within President Trump's power to order it instantly declassified. There's no review of that decision, and then it can be made public. On the other hand, it is really bizarre, just as a reporter who has been in the middle of a controversy for the last 4 years about the leaking of classified information, to hear people suggest that the president now ought to take the most sensitive intercepts that the government is capable of obtaining, which is how they eavesdrop on Russian officials inside the Kremlin and just toss them to the public. Like, there's no problem at all with doing that. I think that what you're seeing here is this really disturbing double standard that all we've heard since the war on terror is that classified information is sacred and anybody who leaks it is treasonous and satanic and belongs in jail for a really long time. And now classified information seems to be something that's just a plaything, like something that we just toss around for fun if it serves a certain agenda. And I think that's one of the issues that's bothering me about the way this discourse is unfolding.
Glenn, we're going to break, then come back and ask you about the Trump-Netanyahu news conference yesterday. We're also going to want to talk about Yemen and the news that the Pentagon is considering U.S. ground troops in Syria. This is Democracy Now! We're talking to Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald. Stay with us. Understanding by Mononome here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
On Wednesday, President Donald Trump ended a long-standing U.S. commitment to the establishment of a Palestinian state, saying he had no preference for either a one-state or two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Trump's comment came during a news conference at the White House with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Looking at two-state and one-state, and I like the one that both parties like. I'm very happy with the one that both parties like. I can live with either one. I thought for a while the two-state looked like it may be the easier of the two. But honestly, if Bibi and if the Palestinians, if Israel and the Palestinians are happy, I'm happy with the one they like the best. As far as the embassy moving to Jerusalem, I'd love to see that happen. We're looking at it very, very strongly. We're looking at it with great care, believe me. And we'll see what happens. Okay?
So that's President Trump speaking yesterday at a joint news conference with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Glenn, could you respond to that and what the significance is of Trump suggesting a significant, massive change to many, many years of a U.S. policy on this?
So I guess I question, first of all, the extent to which it really is such a massive change in U.S. policy. It is, of course, a huge departure rhetorically from what the U.S. government has said for decades, which is that their policy is there ought to be a two-state solution. The reality, though, as any honest person involved in this conflict or who watches it admits, is that the two-state solution has been dying and, in fact, probably dead for many years. It's just that nobody wants to admit it. If you look at a map, it's almost impossible to see where a separate Palestinian state in the West Bank could be created, given the growth of settlements under Prime Minister Netanyahu. Growth which, by the way, the United States not only didn't stop, but abetted by shoveling Israel with money, with weapons, with all kinds of diplomatic support as they were expanding those settlements. Yes, they objected occasionally in rhetoric, but in action never did. And so I think the two-state solution is something that we're all eager not to give up on because the alternatives are both so bad. But the reality is that in Israel, there is an erosion of support for the two-state solution. There are high-level members of Prime Minister Netanyahu's cabinet, high ministers who explicitly oppose it. The reality is that because of the course Israel has taken, the only two options that are real, and it's essentially what Donald Trump in his own kind of stumbling, inept, ignorant way was getting at, was the only two options are have Israel become an apartheid state where a minority of Jews have political rights and control a country in which a majority of citizens have no political rights, exactly like was true of apartheid South Africa, or have one state in which all citizens have political rights, in which case Israel would no longer exist as a Jewish state. Neither of those options are good ones, but that is the course that Israel is taking. And what Trump is saying is essentially, if the Israelis and Palestinians want a certain solution, we, the United States, are not going to prevent them from doing that. What is really worrying is that Donald Trump is empowering some of the worst extremists in the world when it comes to Israeli policy. His son-in-law, who's in charge of it, is a supporter of some of the hardest core settlements in the West Bank. And Congress is taking up this week his nomination of a hardcore pro-settlement lunatic to be the U.S. ambassador to Israel. Just this morning, 5 ambassadors, former ambassadors to Israel of both parties, came out and opposed him on the grounds that he's essentially insane. And so I do think there's a dangerous tilting toward extremists in Israel on the part of the Trump administration. But the two-state solution has really only existed in rhetoric for a long time. And on some level, a lot of supporters of Palestinian rights think it's actually a good thing to finally have that candid admission that a two-state solution is not really possible anymore because of Israeli behavior.
Well, during Wednesday's news conference, President Trump was asked by an Israeli journalist about the rise in anti-Semitic attacks and vandalism across the U.S. Trump responded by boasting about his election victory.
Mr. President, since your election campaign and even after your victory, we've seen a sharp rise in anti-Semitic incident across the United States. And I wonder, what do you say to those among the Jewish community in the States and in Israel and maybe around the world who believe and feel that your administration is playing with xenophobia and maybe racist tones?
Well, I just want to say that we are, very honored by the victory that we had, 306 electoral college votes. We were not supposed to crack 220. You know that, right? there was no way to 221, but then they said there's no way to 270. And there's tremendous enthusiasm out there. I will say that we are going to have peace in this country. We are going to stop crime in this country. We are going to do everything within our power to stop long simmering racism and every other thing that's going on, because a lot of bad things have been taking place over a long period of time. I think one of the reasons I won the election is we have a very, very divided nation, very divided. And hopefully I'll be able to do something about that. And it was something that was very important to me. As far as people, Jewish people, so many friends, a daughter who happens to be here right now, a son-in-law, and 3 beautiful grandchildren. I think that you're going to see a lot different United States of America over the next 3, 4, or 8 years. I think a lot of good things are happening, and you're going to see a lot of love. You're going to see a lot of love. Okay? Thank you.
A lot of love, said President Donald Trump. Well, this is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu responding to the question as well.
I've known President Trump for many years, and to allude to him or to his people, his team, some of whom I've known for many years too. Can I reveal, Jared, how long we've known you? Well, he was never small. He was always big. He was always tall. But I've known the president, and I've known his family and his team for a long time. And there is no greater supporter of the Jewish people and the Jewish state than President Donald Trump. I think we should put that to rest.
After the news conference, the Anti-Defamation League tweeted, "Troubling that POTUS failed to condemn real issue of anti-Semitism in U.S. today." Glenn Greenwald, your response.
You know, I was on your show during the campaign, I think back in March or April, as it looked increasingly likely that Trump was going to be the nominee. And I remember saying at the time that I thought one of the most dangerous parts of the Trump rise and a Trump victory would not necessarily be on the policy level, where there are functional checks on what he can do, as we saw with the courts unanimously striking down his Muslim ban, but that what was more dangerous potentially were the factions inside the United States that he was emboldening and galvanizing and empowering, namely racist, anti-Muslim, anti-Semitic factions that have been more or less muted and almost embarrassed to be out in public, who now feel as though they've been given license to express some of the worst sentiments that human beings are capable of creating. And so whether or not people inside the White House like Steve Bannon or Stephen Miller or others are overt racist or just trivialize and play with those themes in order to gain advantage, I continue to think that that is probably one of the greatest dangers, if not the greatest danger, that he's emboldening that kind of hatred and stoking it and encouraging these resentments among people and targeting the most vulnerable groups, which in history is a really dangerous thing to do. And I think you see in his answer, filled with cliches about how he has a Jewish son-in-law and daughter and grandchildren and how he's going to produce love, this complete kind of contempt for the notion that this is a serious concern and that the kind of rhetoric that he and his closest advisors have embraced really does bring with it the serious danger of unleashing these kind of forces. He's just in denial about that fact.
Well, I want to ask now about Yemen. You've written recently on the attack by U.S. commandos on a Yemeni village last month that left 25 civilians and 1 U.S. soldier dead. Among those killed was Anwar al-Awlaki's daughter, Nawar. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism reports the January 28th assault killed 9 children under the age of 13, with 5 other children wounded. Glenn,
and also We just have this latest news that just came out from AP that the main figure killed in last month's U.S. raid in Yemen targeting al-Qaeda was a tribal leader who was allied with the U.S. and Saudi-backed president and had been enlisted to fight Yemen's Shiite rebels.
Right. And so among those people critical of the raid in which so many were killed, including civilians, was Arizona Republican Senator John McCain.
When you lose a $75 million airplane and, more importantly, American lives are a life is lost and wounded, I don't believe that you can call it a success.
White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer lashed out at Senator McCain and journalists for criticizing President Trump's decision to order the raid.
Success. And I think anyone who would suggest it's not a success does disservice to the life of Chief Ryan Owens. He fought knowing what was at stake in that mission. And anybody who would suggest otherwise doesn't fully appreciate how successful that mission was, what the information that they were able to retrieve was, and how that will help prevent future terrorist attacks. I understand that. I think my statement's very clear on that, Kristen. I think anybody who undermines the success of that raid owes an apology and a disservice to the life of Chief Owens.
Spicer's comments came as the United Nations appealed for $2.1 billion in emergency aid to Yemen. The UN warns 12 million people face the threat of famine brought on by a U.S.-supported, Saudi-led war and naval blockade.
We're talking to Glenn Greenwald, who's written extensively on all these issues in The Intercept. We're going to go to a music break and then hopefully get his response. That's music by Mina. We had just lost Glenn Greenwald. We're speaking to him in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, but I think we got the connection back. Maybe he has a cell phone up to his ear. Glenn, we were just talking about what's happening in Yemen right now, and the latest news from AP that the main figure killed in last month's U.S. raid targeting al-Qaeda was a tribal leader who was allied with the U.S. Saudi-backed president. We only have 30 seconds, but if you can summarize Yemen.
I mean, what's happened in Yemen is an absolute atrocity. It's the poorest country in the region. The U.S. has constantly droned it. The Saudis, with U.S. and U.K. support, have bombed its civilians constantly. People are starving, including children. And the Trump administration seems to be committed to escalating the violence even worse. It's a true tragedy, and we never talk about it in the United States.
And the issue that Spicer raised, that anyone who criticizes the Yemen raid owes an apology to the Navy SEAL's family who was killed. 10 seconds.
It's a resurrection of standard U.S. rhetoric that we heard in the Bush era, that if you criticize the war, then it means you're disrespecting the troops. And it's extra ironic since Trump ran on a platform of opposing the wars in Iraq and Libya, and yet he doesn't seem to apply that same standard to himself, that it means he's disrespecting the troops.
That does it for the show. Glenn Greenwald, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, founding editor of The Intercept. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks for joining us.